La Chine, un ennemi fabriqué par la propagande. Is China an enemy fabricated by propaganda? That's the title of a new book by a French-speaking Luxembourgeois author who has devoted decades as a historian on Xizang, or Tibet, and other China-related issues. His book on Xizang, titled Free Tibet, Power, Society and Ideology in Old Tibet, challenges the so-called Western experts on the issue and the politically correct narratives. Despite having been a lone voice for years, he continues to speak up and dig deeper into how mainstream narratives portray China as the bogeyman. I had the pleasure to sit down with Albert Ettinger, who has authored 4 books about Xizang, its history, and China in general. Mr. Ettinger, welcome to The Point. I understand that you have authored 2 major books on Xizang, or Tibet. One is called Free Tibet, State, Society and Ideology in Old Tibet, and Fight for Tibet, History, Background and Perspectives on an International Conflict. That's almost 10 years ago. And most recently, this year actually, you published another book, which is called China, an Enemy Fabricated by Propaganda. In this book, you actually covered quite a number of topics, such as Hong Kong, such as Taiwan, and Tibet, and Xinjiang as well. So first of all, tell us a bit about yourself. How come, I understand you were a teacher, how come you started being interested in these questions and started writing about your perspectives on these questions?
Yes. My story about China goes back quite a long time. I went already to China in the 70s, so you see I'm of older age, and I was interested in China all this time, and I was confronted to the Tibet question, if you want, as a teacher, because in our school book, I was teaching German literature in the secondary school, and in the school book we had this subject, but it was from a very biased perspective. So I was interested in searching deeper, let's say, and then I decided finally in 2008, it's the year of the Olympic Games in Beijing, and there was a huge propaganda campaign against China, and Tibet. The Tibet subject was very important. So then I decided to dig deeper and to publish something about it. And at the end, the result were these 2 books, two major books.
I understand, I've read other interviews of you, I understand that before you write these books, you had actually not been to Tibet or Xizang. You only dug into the materials that you could find, and you found incoherences, right, inaccuracies in these Western narratives, and you in your book, you fundamentally challenged some of the opinions that are considered authoritative in Tibetology in Western society, such as Alexandra David Nael, just to cite one name, because her views are written in textbooks in Europe as if they are, the representation of truth. How did you do it? I mean, without being into Tibet, what did you do in the literature that you could find, being in Europe, to find these loopholes?
First, I have an advantage, being a Luxembourger. I know several languages, and I could read books both in German and in French and in English. And so I discovered, for example, one of my first main sources was Harer, who is the author of the 7 Years of Tibet in Tibet, a famous book, international bestseller. And I noticed that the French edition and the British edition was in those books, whole passages were omitted. it was censored because they didn't fit in the narrative about Tibet. So this was one important thing I discovered, and I found it even later also in other books that sometimes there are corrections, there are omissions, just of those things who don't match with the Western narrative. So you find some things that don't match so well with this idealistic view of or sweetened view of ancient Tibet, and so on. If I began reading what some early visitors of Tibet wrote about what they saw, what they witnessed, and so I had firsthand, let's say, descriptions of what they and stories what they told about Tibet.
Yeah. So you discovered these paragraphs which were very much critical of what old Tibet was like, and yet when Tibet was introduced in Western textbooks, it gave an idealized image, right?
Exactly.
Concept of this region, and you thought that is not correct. Let's jump a little bit. Let's maybe come back to Tibet in just a moment, because Tibet is just one of the topics where similar problems exist. Actually, in your very latest book called China, an Enemy That's Fabricated by Propaganda, you took on an enemy, a very powerful enemy, which is the mainstream media, right? What you see. Yeah. And why do you say that? Why do you say that China is an enemy that's fabricated by propaganda?
Because I think that there are no problems between Europe, for example, and China. China is not really a geopolitical rival of any major European country. It's a rival of the United States, and it has been declared to be a rival and even an enemy of the United States by the United States, not by China. And so I think that it lays in the best interest of Europe and of the European countries to have good relations with China. And unfortunately, the narrative, the mainstream media, and so on, is controlled or are controlled by the United States and by people who work for the United States too. So I think the narrative is very biased, and I try to redress this a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Could you give an example, an outstanding example of why the narrative is extremely biased?
Oh, there's a whole long list of examples. It's difficult to choose one, but for example, in general, China is perceived in the Western media as a dystopian society, and as a country, as an aggressive country, aggressive towards the neighbors and so on. And I find this very biased, because when I look at Chinese foreign policy, for example, I see policy of peace and of peaceful coexistence since the existence of the People's Republic, and I don't see any aggressivity, except if you want to characterize it as aggressive, that China wants to hold its own territory, and it wants to reunify with Taiwan, for example. But that's not aggressive. I find it much more aggressive when warships, American and even now European, French and German warships cross the Taiwan Strait, whereas China never crossed the channel between England and the continent. So I find that this characterization of China as aggressive is completely biased.
Well, some people would say, just being an advocate, some people would say, how can you say all the media, all the different media are working for the United States? They would question you, right? They would say that these
Of course.
media, first of all, work for different countries. They come from different country. They are not, some of them are funded not by the government. Some of them are, not only affiliated with the state, and they are not, how can you say they are all working for the United States?
For example, in Germany and in France, there is a huge network, Atlantic network, if you want, who promotes American interests, and there are young leader programs and so on since the end of Second World War, when the Americans came to Europe with troops and so on, and since then we have. We assist to the establishment of this kind of network, and this is one side. They have people who are part of these networks in the media. They have people in politics, in the economy, also in the institutions, and so they have a strong influence. It's what is called the soft power of the USA, and the soft power is very, very strong. And then you have the news agencies, who are mainly American also, and the newspapers like New York Times or Washington Post. They are really they have a huge influence also on Western media in general. And often Western media they don't have even the possibility, the capacity of having everywhere some reporters and so on. So they copy what the New York Times writes, and so there are a lot of strings. Let's say that upwards by the American elites. Yeah.
How much is prejudice, bias part of this? Because one thing is to have deliberate campaign, to make China look bad. The other is, I perceive there's a inherent or long-standing bias that comes out without knowing almost. I don't know whether you see
Absolutely.
that as part of the problem as well.
Absolutely, yes. I think that China never had a very good press in the Occident, in the West. Since the establishment of the People's Republic, at least, there was the Cold War and the fear of communism, and so it goes back to this time of Cold War. But even before, we have our countries were all colonizing China, or trying to colonize China. French had colonies, Germans had colonies, British had, of course, colonies, and the Americans, they had huge economic interest and influence also. So yeah, it goes back to this colonial view of the world also. I have often the impression that still most or a lot of Europeans have this old view of the world, not only of China, but of whole Asia and of Africa and so on. Yeah.
How susceptible are the general public towards this kind of narrative? Do you think they are buying to this kind of narrative readily, or are there certain critical regards, as I say, or some people will think about it critically, or are they taking it in as if these are facts?
I think that most people don't think about it. It's a problem that people are not so much interested in foreign policy, and so most people don't think about it and they buy it. But of course, there are a lot of people who know China, who maybe visited China, and who listen to alternative media, who are critical and who don't buy it. But I think, I'm afraid, most people buy it without thinking about it.
How so? Because if you think about the level of education, the living standard, you would feel that you would have the impression that people would be more critical thinkers and they would be more sophisticated in terms of their consumption of information. Is that the case?
I don't think so. People are interested in material things, in their material well-being, much more than in politics normally. We have a population that is not very politicized, I think. It's not very interested in, above all, not interested in foreign policy. And people believe what they read in the newspapers mostly. So, and the journalists who could know better, especially, they are interested in not knowing better, because if they know better and they write something they shouldn't, they have maybe career problems. So it's better for them to not to look too closely and so on things.
You're talking about peer pressure, you're talking about groupthink and the pressure of it?
Exactly. About conforming to the general opinion of and the politically to the political elites and their opinions and views.
But people are talking about Western society being a free, open society, being a society where you have freedom of expression, freedom of belief, freedom of thoughts. There's no or little censorship. But what you are saying seems to point to quite different a picture.
Yeah, there's no official censorship, but censorship exists. And for example, I can say that my books, for example, were not reviewed by any major newspaper in Luxembourg even. And publishing of this kind of books in Luxembourg is a rare thing, so rare event. So, but nobody ever asked me for an interview in Luxembourg or in France even, or in Germany. My first book, my books were first published in Germany, and I was on some how you call it book fairs in Germany, and the press was never interested in anything I've said. So there were no critical questions or no critical reactions to anything I wrote. So I can give you another example. I don't know if you know the French filmmaker Jean-Michel Carré. He made a huge documentary about China maybe 10 years ago, and for Arte, the TV,
the French-German TV station.
French-German, yeah. And he made a documentary about Tibet too. More recently, and he had huge problems to have it accepted by Arte. There was a lot of censorship, and for example, since I know him, he interviewed me too for his documentary, and the responsible man at Arte, he refused immediately to let me speak in this documentary, and some other people also. They were banned immediately, and they checked every wording in this documentary, and he had to remake it several times to change different wordings and so on, and the narrative a little bit, and at the end, after maybe 2 or 3 years of discussions and quarrels and so on, this documentary was not shown finally, and there were some anti-Chinese scholars or intellectuals, and they immediately alerted other people, and they wrote a letter so that it was dropped by Arte and it was dropped by Belgian state TV. This is censorship. We have this censorship, but it's behind the curtain. You don't see it normally, and normally it works easier because people conform to what is asked from them. So Jean-Michel, he was an exception.
Yeah, I see that, for instance, you talked about your book in the Frankfurt Book Fair as well, and you made a video of it, but it's a very, how shall I say, it's a very lonely voice. You know, you...
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, and I could feel the kind of absolute non-interest, or display of non-interest to topics, because this is a very difficult topic to write, because your enemy is very formidable. You're not only taking on some monks, you're taking on a whole narrative, you're taking on the army of journalists. Basically you're saying what you have been saying is wrong, and that is a very courageous thing to do. Why do you do that? Do you feel in any way strong pressure for keep doing what you're doing?
Yes, of course. I think that the truth has to come out, and I cannot accept injustice, and I cannot accept lies. So I have to do something about it. But I must say I'm fortunate, maybe, because I feel quite safe, because I have no career before me. I'm of an age, I'm retired, so I have there's no risk, not the same risk as for young journalists, for example, to tell the truth. So I'm assuming it. Yeah.
Yeah. When you were writing these books, you had not been to Tibet, but later on, you actually had the opportunity to go to Tibet. Tell us about these trips, and whether what you wrote, in the books were shored up, were verified by what you saw.
Yeah, of course. Yes, I must say that I've written mostly about older Tibet and about the history of Tibet. So it was not so important to having been to Tibet actually, because I wrote about the past. But I could measure the gap between what was Tibet before, because I knew it by reading and so on of people who visited Tibet, and Tibet, present time Tibet. So this I could really see very well, and I saw a country that has had a huge development, the huge modernization of infrastructure, of well-being of people. I saw a country that cherish still the traditions. I saw a lot of monks, maybe even too many for my taste, and a lot of pilgrims and so on in the Bakra and so on. So this doesn't match at all with what we are told in Europe and in the USA. First time I went by plane from Beijing immediately to
When
Lhasa.
was that?
Oh, it's already nearly 10 years ago, I think.
Okay.
8-9 years ago, I don't know. And another time I went now by the new highway. Yeah, it's tremendous. If you know that Tibet was completely closed before 1950, and there were no roads at all in whole of Tibet. First roads were built by Chinese, by the Chinese PLA, and afterwards all this infrastructure that you see, all the bridges and all, it's impressive. It's impressive. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you were writing about Western records by Huxley, for instance, when he first went to Lhasa, and his description of Lhasa was just appalling, how abject the conditions were, and yet people seem not to put that against what they're reading in the popular mainstream description of the old Tibet, the idealized place. Anyway, if you look at this kind of huge gaps and appalling incoherences, what do you take away as the core of the fallacy that we're trying to fight against? And I'm saying this not just for the Europeans or the Americans or Chinese, for people everywhere. What do we really have to be mindful of when we are taking in information about a place that we have never been to, that we don't know much, or even we've heard about, but we don't know much? What do you think is the biggest lesson that we have to constantly remind ourselves of when we understand this world?
For me, the lesson is to not to believe what mainstream media are writing or saying.
Take it with a grain of salt.
Taking everything with a grain of salt, and the best is looking deeper, digging deeper, and go and visit, especially for China. Go and visit China, and you'll see that it's quite different from everything you hear and you see in the West. It's a good thing that now we can even come without visa. It's visa free for 2 weeks, I think, visiting China, and I would wish to that this would also be true for Tibet, because Tibet is still a little bit journey in Tibet is still a little bit restricted.
Yeah. Hopefully this will change. But for other places, for Xinjiang, for instance, now people can go.
It's completely open. Yeah. I know. But for Tibet, of course, it's because of the history of the place, because there were all these turmoil and so on, and of course there were some times where people could travel, also foreigners could travel very freely, and even without special visas and so on. So it's it's important to go to the places and to speak to people, and to hear to see the other side of the coin, let's say.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much, Albert Ettinger, for sharing with us your insights.